Good evening, everyone. Great to see you tonight. It's good that you can come out in the middle of the week, spend some time together, learn a bit, and enjoy our night here around the book of Hosea. We're going to get our night started with our first hymn, which will be hymn number 88, and then prayer. Yahweh, our great God, we come to you now as we set aside some time in our week to give you thanks, to show our appreciation. You've kept us safe. You've brought us together now as the end of our day. We've got some time to stop and consider you, to contemplate your faithfulness, your love that doesn't change. You've given us a hope. You've given so many people a hope of life in your coming kingdom when you send your Son back to this earth, and that's something we are so grateful for, those promises that are new every morning. We consider these things and we think about and reflect often. We pray for your guidance, everything we do tonight. Might we consider these things, take them into our hearts, might we focus on them and take them away with us for the rest of our week and dwell on them further. Help us to grow, help us to develop our faithfulness before you. So we ask for thy care to be over all the things we do. We thank you now for our time together. We pray in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. All right, welcome to those who have just joined us. Get yourselves settled in. Brother Vaughn's going to be leading us tonight around Hosea, in particular Hosea 7, and the theme for tonight is, O Ephraim, what shall I do with you? To get started, we're going to read from Hosea chapter 7, and then we'll get Brother Vaughn up to lead us tonight. So reading with you, Hosea 7. When I would have healed Israel, then the iniquity of Ephraim was discovered, and the wickedness of Samaria. For they committed falsehood, and the thief cometh in, and the troop of robbers spoileth without. And they consider not in their hearts that I remember all their wickedness. Now their own doings have beset them about, they are before my face. They make the king glad with their wickedness, and the princes with their lies. They are all adulterers, as an oven heated by the baker, who ceaseth from raising after he hath kneaded the dough until it be leavened. In the day of our king, the princes have made him sick with bottles of wine. He stretched out his hand and with scorners. For they have made ready their heart like an oven, whilst they lie in wait. Their baker sleepeth all the night. In the morning it burneth as a flaming fire. They are all hot as an oven, and have devoured their judges. All the kings are fallen. There is none among them that calleth unto me. Ephraim, he hath mixed himself amongst the people. Ephraim is a cake not turned. Strangers have devoured his strength, and he knoweth it not. Yea, grey hairs are here and there upon him, yet he knoweth not. And the pride of Israel testifieth to his face, and they do not return to Yahweh their God, nor seek him for all this. Ephraim also is like a silly dove without heart. They call to Egypt, they go to Assyria. When they shall go, I will spread my net upon them. I will bring them down as the fowls of heaven. I will chastise them as their congregation hath heard. Woe unto them, for they have fled from me. Destruction unto them, because they have transgressed against me. Though I have not redeemed them, yet they have spoken lies against me, and they have not cried unto me with their heart. When they howled upon their beds, they assemble themselves for corn and wine, and they rebel against me. Though I have bound and strengthened their arms, yet do they imagine mischief against me. They return, but not to the Most High. They are like a deceitful bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword, for the rage of their tongue. This shall be their derision in the land of Egypt. All right, Brother Vaughn, over to you. We look forward to your words tonight around, O Ephraim, what shall I do with you?
Thanks, Brother Jay, and good evening, brothers and sisters, young people, and to everyone who is joining us on Zoom. A warm welcome to you as well. Lovely to see you all out here tonight as we continue in our studies now looking at Hosea. I apologise that I kind of mucked up your schedule a little bit in terms of the sequence it's supposed to go, so we're a little bit further away from our last class than I think would be ordinary, but thank you for working with me on that. I appreciate it. So for those who are here and for those who can recall from the last class, here is just a quick overview again of our little series that we're going through. And we ended our last session, if you recall, if you were here or listened in, we were talking about this difficulty that God has throughout the book of Hosea. We alluded to it a few times in the last class, that in some of the passages of Hosea, God displays this struggle that he goes through, that he's going through with the people. And we want to spend some time in tonight's class trying to understand that and see that a little bit better. Hosea, as we know, he was trying to get the people to understand certain things about God. Because he says one of the things that has massively contributed to the current spiritual state of the nation of Israel at this time. We ran out of time to look at this in our last class. But this is a really important theme from the book of Hosea. In Hosea chapter 8 and verse 2, the people make this claim, and the people say, confidently, the people claim to know God. My God, they say, we know you. But God, throughout the entire book of Hosea, makes it abundantly clear, like, for example, in chapter 4, up there, that the people, in fact, had no idea about who God really was. And God says there in Hosea 4 and verse 1, Yahweh brings a charge against the inhabitants of the land, that's against Israel. There is no truth or mercy or knowledge of God in the land. And verse 6 of chapter 4, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. So there are things that Hosea is trying to tell the people, that he wants to tell the people, things that they don't know about God, things that they need to know about God. One, and this is what we looked at and came out quite powerfully in our last class, was God's mercy and his love for them. Something that we looked at quite in depth last time, and we actually ran out of time. There was a few extra bits which we ran out of time in our last class, but I guess just to go back to that now, something I want us to think about, this idea of the love of God, because if you recall, that's what Hosea was called to show to his wife, to that woman. All through the book, there are amazing examples of God's love for his people that is shown and demonstrated. Hosea has more to say about love than any of the other prophets, especially the minor prophets. You know, he's almost like, in a sense, a bit like the Deuteronomy of the first 5 books. You know how Deuteronomy just has this like explosion of mentions of love. If you look at a graph of how often love is mentioned, the first 4 books, you've got a few references to it. But when you get to Deuteronomy, it's got all these amazing references and passages that talk about the love that God has for his people. And that's kind of like what Hosea is like amongst the prophets. It really stands out compared to the rest of them when we're describing this idea about God's love. I mean, all the prophets, some of them mention and say things about God's love, but then we get to Hosea, and Hosea just elevates it to this new level and this new understanding about what God's love is really like for his people, and the lengths that he's willing to go to show that love to his people. It's like almost like this New Testament level. And we see some of the themes of God being a father and God being a husband to his people. And we see those, of course, developed when we get to the New Testament. There are phrases in Hosea that are quite intimate in nature when we read it. In Hosea 2 verse 14, that's up there on the screen, for example, of God talking about alluring, his people to the wilderness. He's trying to draw them out in this way to speak comfortably to them. It's like this romantic sort of language. And when you read through Hosea, especially when you get to chapter 14, we've got so many allusions to the similar kind of language to the Song of Solomon, like no other book. And of course, we know what the themes are in the Song of Solomon. This is God in this book showing his intimate desire and his intimate love for his people. And we need to feel that in ourselves, brothers and sisters, and in our relationship with our God. How he treats you and how he's willing to work with you and continue to work with you, no matter what's happening in your life right now, no matter the habits and the things that we sort of keep finding ourselves falling into. God actually is still wanting and willing to work with you, and he wants to speak comfortably to you, as it says there. He wants to allure you and draw you out into the wilderness where you and I can be his and his alone, away from the distraction of everything else around us. Hosea is using imagery throughout his book like no other prophet. And he's trying to appeal to his people, to get them to wake up to the reality of how God actually really feels this deep connection towards them. This isn't some kind of, wishy-washy, sentimental kind of love. This is real, deep love that despite hurt, still endures. That despite pain is still faithful through those moments. This is exactly who God is. This is the God of Israel. The God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. This is the God that we serve. And this needs to be the driving force in our relationships, in our discipleships. To see the heart of God, as it were, in this book being poured out to his people. He's revealing that to us. And seeing the intent being, not to just make them feel good, but to make them realise and to help us to realise that we've got a God that we can turn to all the time. And we need to respond to him in that. And so next, following on from those kind of ideas, we want to look tonight at the struggle, the difficulty that God expresses and that he has with his people. And Hosea wants them to know, and it's quite apparent when you read through the book of Hosea, that God struggles. This is one of the things that maybe we don't think about all that often, is that, when we sin, our response to sin, and if you're anything like me maybe, the standard response to sin is, yeah, I feel bad. I hate that I've, let this overcome me. I don't want that sin to have a hold on me like that. But maybe when we're done with our class tonight, maybe we'll have an added aspect to our attitude. It might change slightly so that when we find ourselves perhaps stuck in sin, various sins and failings in our life, we actually think, how does this make God feel? How does he feel about my own failings and at times when I've fallen short and been unfaithful to him? And that's what Hosea, and that's what I hope we really get a chance to think about tonight. I think the people in Hosea's time hadn't really been thinking about the impact of their sins in their life, the impact that had on God. And that's what we want to think about tonight. Now, before we do, probably could have done this last time, but it's good to get an overall view of Hosea. I think I did say last time, Hosea is not the most structured of books. It's not like, for example, Amos. We did go to Amos briefly last time. Amos is very structured, very kind of clearly laid out. But when you get to Hosea, it's not quite like that. So Hosea basically has 3 parts, and there's different ways that Hosea can be broken up, but here's a suggested breakdown. The first 3 chapters, which is kind of what we dealt with last time, this is all about the reality of Hosea's marriage. Those first 3 chapters outline how he got married, the children that he had, how Gomer, his wife, left him, and how he went out to find her again. And we dealt with those ideas last time. So that's the first 3 chapters. Chapter 4 to 13 are Hosea's message that follows this story. And that's actually what makes up the majority of the book of Hosea. It's basically describing everything that's happened. Everything that has happened between Israel and God that has caused God to feel the need to use this metaphor in the first place. And that's how the book works. And God is going through Israel, here's what you've done, here's what you've done, here's what you've done. It goes through these cycles of unfaithfulness, the discipline that God brings, and then the reformation, the restoration that he brings out in his people. And of course we saw that that's what Hosea had to go through with his wife as well. She was unfaithful to him, and he went out and disciplined her and restored her back to her position. And then chapter 14, the last part, is just this amazing ending to the whole book. That when you read through it, you don't almost expect it to end in that way with chapter 14. You almost don't expect it to be in Hosea, but it is. And it's this wonderful vision of future restoration and transformation that God is trying to work in his people. That's basically how the book of Hosea works. Now keep in mind, when we look at this theme of God's difficulty, God did bring an end to Israel. So when we're talking, of course, about the fact that God loves them, but he doesn't condone sin, in the end, the issue is, are the people going to respond? Will the people come back to God? God, he remains the same. He'll be there. He won't move. He'll be always ready to accept them when they come back. But in the end, he makes it abundantly clear he will judge sin. It's not like he will just let it just keep going on forever. There will be a point in time where he brings that sin and he will judge it. He won't just let it go on forever. But as we looked at last time, God has made appeal after appeal after appeal, trying to get his people to change before that judgment comes, which was necessary. And so the interesting thing is, with Hosea, is that he primarily, mainly presents God as a husband, right? We saw that with Hosea being the husband to Gomer. Primarily, that's how God is presented in the book. And he uses this metaphor. But the other metaphor that is also mentioned in this book, in chapter 11, is that he is like a father to a son. You see that language used quite a bit as well. So really close relationships we're talking about here. But we ask the question, what does that add to Hosea's message? And I'll just read, there's a quote which I like from a writer of one of the commentaries that I was reading. And he writes this in context of explaining God as a husband to his people. And, it adds this dimension to the book, and here it is. The writer says, perhaps this is why Hosea captures, as no other writer does, the tension within God's love for his elect. For he refuses to ease the pain of the relationship by either compromising or quitting or giving up. In other words, God doesn't let them go. He doesn't divorce them. He won't end the pain of that relationship, which might seem easier, by compromising or quitting. He loves these people despite their blatant unfaithfulness, which he cannot for a moment condone. And that's what's really happening in the book of Hosea. When you read through, we've already looked at a couple of these already, you get these passages where God is seriously struggling with the relationship. I want to show you a couple just to start off our discussion. Come with me to chapter 6, Hosea 6 and verse 4. And maybe if you are taking notes, just take a note of a couple of these as to where some of these are and how they work, because these are really important verses, I think, in the book of Hosea. So Hosea 6 and verse 4. And this is where we got the title for tonight. Hosea 6 verse 4, this is God speaking. O Ephraim, what shall I do to you? O Judah, what shall I do to you? So Judah is included in this as well, by the way. From time to time, Judah does get a mention in this book. He continues there, for your faithfulness is like a morning cloud, and like the early dew it goes away. Therefore, I have hewn them by the prophets, I have slain them by the words of my mouth, and your judgments are like light that goes forth. For I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. Now it's interesting here and important to know where this statement comes from God in the context. He's just said in chapter 5, if you turn back there with me, in chapter 5, God has some pretty amazing statements. Just have a look at verse 6 of chapter 5. This is the context of what we just read in chapter 6, right? So verse 6, this is the context where God says, Judah, Ephraim, what am I going to do with you? Chapter 5, verse 6, with their flocks and herds, they shall go to seek Yahweh, but they will not find him. Now look at this one. This, brothers and sisters, is another extreme statement. He has withdrawn himself from them. And that's repeated. The same idea that God has withdrawn himself from the people. In chapter 5, verse 15, God says there, I will return again to my place. Do you know what that's saying? It's basically saying there, a group of people, this group of people who have believed for a long time that the God of Israel is their God, that he came down, they received the commandments from them, he gave them to their leaders. We've gotten to a point now in Israel's history, this is how bad the relationship has become, where God says, do you know what? I'm done. I'm going to withdraw from you now. And that, when you think about God getting to the point with this people who are so stubborn, who are so unwilling to listen and so unwilling to change and reform and respond to the love that he's showing to them, that basically the only choice that God has left is to say, do you know what? I'm going back to my place. And that is, when you think about it, totally contrary, isn't it, to everything we know about how God has revealed himself in the Old Testament. You think about how, up until this point, how God has revealed himself. People knew God as a God who was close to his people. Isn't that true? God says to his people all the time, if you seek me, you'll find me. God was accessible in the Old Testament. He's contrasted against the other gods in the Old Testament. He wasn't a God that was afar off, like the stupid, gods of the pagans. It's, the classic story with Elijah and the contest on Mount Carmel, and where's Baal, and he's off in the bathroom somewhere or something like that, or on a holiday. These other gods who are angry and all this kind of stuff. God is unique amongst those other gods. He's extremely accessible. He wants to be accessible to his people. You could pray to him and he would be with you and he could lead you. And there's quotes like in Isaiah which talk about how he would take them by their right hand and lead them. God was close. But for God now to say in Hosea, and we've got to feel the impact of these words because they're so easy to just read over. For God to say now, you can't find me, I'm going to withdraw and leave, and I'm going to withdraw to my place and no longer be with you. We're seeing the struggle that he's having with his people, the difficulty in this book. These are extreme statements. It's a bit like the one that we looked at in our last class where God said, I will no longer be your I will be. And this is another one of those extreme changes. And right in the wake of saying this, like it's almost like as soon as the words come out of God's mouth, his heart is affected again. He can't help it. And he says, O Ephraim, if we go back to chapter 6, verse 4, O Ephraim, what am I going to do with you? O Judah, what shall I do to you? So in the context of what we've just looked at, brothers and sisters, just think about what that's really saying. Do you remember when Jesus was teaching and that man came up to Jesus and said, Good master, what do I need to do to be saved? You think that's a fair question when people come to God, when they seek God and they ask, what is it that you want me to do? What's my attitude? What sort of faith do you want me to have? It's normal for people to go to God searching for him. But brothers and sisters, chapter 6, verse 4, it reverses that, doesn't it? This isn't a human crying out to God, trying to find out where God is. Chapter 6, verse 4 is God doing the reverse. He's crying out to his people, trying to find out where are they. This is, in chapter 6, verse 4, this is not the people crying out, asking God for help. This is God crying out to his people, not understanding what they're doing or how to work with them. It's completely the reverse, isn't it, of what the case should be. I sort of think about this in our own lives, in my own life as a disciple. And I think Hosea makes us reflect on this. I wonder sometimes what's being said more in my own life, or what is the case in my own life. Do I find myself crying out to God in my prayers, desperately trying to see him and to find him in my life? Because sometimes I think maybe it might be the other way around at times. For me, this is really powerful. And maybe God is saying, do you know what? At times in my life and my discipleship, where is Vaughn? Like I'm trying to call out to him, I'm trying to find him, and I'm trying to work with him here. But he's just walking the wrong way. Continually doesn't give me time. And God, in a sense, is having these thoughts of, what am I going to do with you? What can I do with you? I don't even know where you are. What are you doing? Brothers and sisters, I think that's a really important and powerful thought to think about. Can God find me? Am I in a place where I'm letting him work with me? Or am I stiff-necked like these people and making it difficult for him? A simple question, but really profound in this context. How many of us prayed last night before we went to bed? I'm not expecting hands or anything like that to go up. But ask yourself, did you? Not just for dinner or anything like that, but actually talk to God before bed. You think about how significant that question is, because prayer for us sometimes is just like, if I remember. But if God is looking down on us as sons and daughters and doesn't see anyone here actually crying out, trying to find him, what can he do with that? What can he do with us? Think about that. If we're not praying, how can God actually work with you and me if he doesn't see us fighting desperately to hang on to him in our lives. You know, when we have troubles in our life and things are difficult and hard to try and work through, if in those moments we're not crying out to him, in those moments, how can he work with us? And he feels the same way toward his people right here in Hosea. Chapter 6, verse 4. "O Ephraim, what shall I do to you? Your faithfulness is like a morning cloud." Yeah, this is the issue of chapter 6. God's difficulty with you and me sometimes is our faithfulness can be, or our goodness can sometimes be like a morning cloud. It's like the early dew that quickly disappears. I don't know if you've ever had that experience. Obviously, like in Perth, more likely in winter when it's a bit cooler, but when you go out really early and you see the grass and it's covered with dew and it's glistening in the sunlight, it looks beautiful, nice and fresh. But sometimes just in the short time my drive to work, actually not that short, it feels quite long these days, but in that time the sun's come up and it can just be completely gone. Just that little bit of extra warmth and it's just, you wouldn't even know that it was there. And God's saying sometimes, Ephraim, that's what your faithfulness, that's what your goodness can be like. It's there in the morning and it looks nice at one stage. Your faithfulness to me is committed there in the morning, or maybe it's there at the start of the week. But by the time the day or the week starts to roll along, or, you know, after Sunday has passed and we're back to our, I hesitate to say normal lives, but back to, you know, the grind of daily life on a Monday, God has disappeared out of the picture. It's a challenge, isn't it? About maintaining our consistency in our discipleship. And sometimes I think we can feel like that. Sometimes our faithfulness can be like a morning cloud. And tonight we want to get into the mind of God and see the impact, how that affects God, how that affects him and how that makes him feel. And maybe that can stir us up to return to him. So we want to look through, spend a bit of time in chapter 7 tonight, which is our reading, because we're not going to go through in lots of detail. As I said, we're doing a bit more of a thematic kind of look in Hosea of these classes. But there's 4 things in chapter 7, and you may have noticed them before. You might already have some notes there from other classes you've heard or when you've looked at it. But there are 4 things that I think are really practical for us to think about. And these were things that Israel, Ephraim, was doing, which I believe was causing God distress. So chapter 7, 4 examples, and maybe, you know, you'll be able to relate to 1, 2, some of these as we go through, just as I have. So chapter 7 and verse 8. We've got one of our first sources of God's difficulty, a source of unfaithfulness for Israel. This is one of the first ones. Verse 8. Ephraim has mixed himself among the peoples. Ephraim is a cake unturned. Funny description, isn't it? Ephraim is a cake unturned. What does that mean? Well, I'll give you a little bit of background, some baking background on how they used to bake back in the day, in those days, which I won't go to in detail, but I wonder if you notice we're going through chapter 7, it's kind of interesting. Hosea seems locked in, doesn't he, to this metaphor, as Jay was reading it for us, this metaphor of like an oven, a baker with an oven. I'm not sure if you noticed that as we're reading through. He talks about the baker there in verse 4. They are all adulterers, like an oven heated by a baker. And so ovens back then, and look, there were probably different types. You probably look it up and you find a few different ones. But the one that I could find the most info on, what they do is it's sort of shaped, kind of like the one on the screen, a little bit like a beehive sort of shape. And the baker would come along, and from the analogy that Hosea is using anyway, and, you know, the baker would come and he'd shove it full of, you know, wood and things to burn, stuff you could burn to get that whole oven really hot. And once it was really, really hot, the baker would come and he would clear it all out, shovel all that stuff out. So now it's just the heat of the actual oven itself that's left behind. The stone and the latent heat would keep it really hot. And then he'd take the dough that he'd made while he was waiting for it to get hot, and he would place it in the oven. Or sometimes they would like stick it on the inside of the oven like that. So all this stored up heat, energy that's in the oven would then nicely cook the bread. And at some point, the baker would have to come along and he'd need to take that little cake and need to flip it onto the other side. And the heat that was stored in the actual oven itself would then cook the other side of the bread. So that's the analogy that Hosea is using. Hosea has been clearly using baking language through chapter 7 about kneading the dough, preparing the oven, getting it hot. And then he says in verse 8, Ephraim, you're like a cake that hasn't been turned. In other words, you're only half-baked. That's what he says. Because if you were a baker and you left one of those cakes and you didn't turn it, it'd be nicely cooked, probably overcooked on one side, but the other side would just be this wet, doughy mess. You know, we know that from experience, don't we? You know, bread that hasn't been cooked, I mean, cookies are a bit different, that's kind of okay, but bread that hasn't been cooked properly, it's not the best. You know, it's like someone baking bread for the first time, which you may have experienced before when they're, you know, trying something new and they decide to give, you know, baking bread a go. It can be a little bit hit and miss for the first couple of times. And they've kneaded the dough and they've popped it in the oven, but maybe they're a bit too eager getting it out of the oven. And so the outside looks okay. It's nice and sort of hard and crispy. It looks cooked, but then you cut into it and it's like, ugh, it's all just like uncooked and doughy and just bleh, like on the inside. And that's kind of what God is saying to Ephraim. Your spiritual life, it's not well done. It's half-baked. Now you think about that, brothers and sisters. This is one of the things that God is struggling with his people. Maybe you can relate to this. Maybe you know what's half-baked in your discipleship at the moment. I can certainly think of things in my own life that would be considered half-baked. But brothers and sisters, we need to let the message of Hosea speak to us and get some fire back into that oven, don't we? And turn that part of our lives around and actually get it cooked properly and ready for God. Because there's nothing that God finds more difficult, and this is part of the message that I take from Hosea, brothers and sisters, than people who come to him who claim to be followers of Christ, but don't really have any intention of going 100% for God. And by 100%, I'm not meaning, you know, in the superficial external things, but going 100% in being totally devoted to communicating with God, reading, prayer, serving each other, trying to follow Christ in our lives. Not that any of us will be perfect by any means, but doing our best, trying to follow his example. You know, these people that God is referring to here in Hosea, these people would turn up on a Sunday. They might be baptized, would be baptized. They would take the bread and the wine. It looks like from that perspective they've got everything to do with God on Sunday. But come Monday, completely different person. They've got nothing to do with God. The prayer life is non-existent. Not willing to stand up for their beliefs, maybe at uni, or maintain the principles that they espouse on a Sunday when they're at work on a Monday, or have those principles influence the way that they act and behave in their lives, or in their career choices, in sorting out what, you know, our priorities should be in our life. God sees that, brothers and sisters, as half-baked discipleship. Fully baked discipleship does not mean that you're perfect, but it means that there is a conscious commitment to striving to follow God's principles. And brothers and sisters, God makes this so clear. Half-baked discipleship in the end is no discipleship. It's not what God is interested in. Just take the example of Israel in this case. Half-baked discipleship for the nation of Israel, what did that result in for them? Being taken captive by the Assyrians, deported to other lands, stranded as refugees. So that was God's first difficulty, that his people are half-baked. The next one is in verse 9, and this one is really, for various reasons, come to hit home for me in recent years. In verse 9 of chapter 7, aliens have devoured his strength, but he does not know it. Yes, grey hairs are here and there on him, yet he does not know it. Rotherham says, even grey hairs are sprinkled upon him, and he knoweth it not. Kind of like they've been sort of, sprinkled on with a salt and pepper shaker, and, in this analogy, hasn't noticed it, hasn't picked up on it. So what's that saying? This person has grey hairs, but they're unaware. They haven't looked in a mirror. They're oblivious to the fact that they've got these grey hairs. So what's the spiritual analogy? Well, I think it's being in a place spiritually, but unaware of it. Now, annoyingly, I've started to see, grey hairs have started to crop up in my beard, which is disappointing. I know I've got them in my hair. I'm well aware of that. Gave up on those ones a long time ago. But when I started noticing my beard, I was like, oh, heck, that's just one. I can deal with that, and I'll just pluck that one out, because otherwise I feel like it's really noticeable amongst the rest of them, and it just makes me, as Em tells me, look so much older. Now I've gotten to the point where it's just basically losing battle. It'd be a very patchy beard if I kept doing that. But grey hair in Scripture, brothers and sisters, what is grey hair normally associated with? Was that old age? Yeah, and there's probably another wisdom. Yeah, all the ones with grey hair are like, wisdom! Yes, that's right. Normally it's referring to wisdom, but you're right, old age as well. And that's, I think in the case of Hosea here, it's really not wisdom that is being referred to. It's definitely more a sign of age, and particularly degeneration is what we're talking about. And in typical Hosea style, Hosea is describing Ephraim as someone who this degeneration is happening to, but they're actually not aware that it's even happening. They haven't actually looked in a mirror and seen that it's happening. And brothers and sisters, I guess the analogy here is we can find ourselves sometimes, or maybe not find ourselves, in this spiritual place of degeneration that's going on, and we may not even be aware of it. And the only solution to it actually is to look in a mirror, to see that happening and realise what is happening to us from a spiritual perspective. And then when you do see the grey hairs coming through, and in the analogy that is being used here, it's this idea of there is some form of degeneration that's going on, you can do something about it. You can address that in the case that's going on here. But Hosea's point when he's describing this is that the people are slowly deteriorating spiritually. They haven't looked in a mirror. There's no self-reflection going on. And the message to Ephraim from Hosea, from God, is that they need to find out what are those grey hairs, and you need to do something about that. So just ask yourself, and maybe for each of us individually, what are those things that we find perhaps insidiously starting to creep in that degenerate your spiritual outlook on life, that pull you away, that take you away from certain things. Maybe it's affecting your prayer life. Maybe that's not as good as it used to be. Maybe the reading of the Scripture, maybe attending ecclesial activity, whatever the case might be. If there is something that's degenerating, this is the appeal, is to become aware of it. And maybe that's one of the grey hairs that's been slowly growing, is really popping out, and it's quite noticeable now. And we haven't really noticed until Hosea speaks to us. And the challenge then is to look in the mirror, each of us, to see those and do something about it. So moving on from that one to the next one, chapter 7, we're still in, and verse 11 now. So 7 verse 11, Ephraim also is like a silly dove, without sense. They call to Egypt, they go to Assyria. Now, we don't really have time, but if you recall, we did talk about this briefly last time. The history of the northern kingdom, it all began, didn't it, with Jeroboam setting up the false worship with the cows, the cow worship, in Bethel and Dan, with the intention that it would stop the people from the northern kingdom going down into the southern kingdom, down to Jerusalem to worship, because they could just worship in Bethel and Dan. Here are your gods. You can do that. We can do our own thing up here. We don't need to go down to Jerusalem. So the whole nation of Israel, up in the northern part of the kingdom, from the very start, from its very inception with Jeroboam, was unfaithful to God, with this slack, easy, lazy approach to their worship. It was all about convenience. Don't worry about going down to Jerusalem. That's way too far away. We've got one up here in Dan and one down there in Bethel. Super convenient. Just hang around here and worship these cows. And so whenever the northern kingdom was in trouble, the people, rather than calling on God, would start calling to places like Assyria, which was quite ironic. Why was that ironic for them to be calling on Assyria? they were their enemy. But particularly, what was, I guess, unique about Assyria, like I'm looking a bit into the future here from Israel's perspective, what would eventually happen in their relationship with Assyria? Absolutely. The Assyrians were the ones who would eventually be the ones to come and, flatten them and take them away into captivity. It was that nation. And ironically, that's the one that they're going to before that to try and seek help. But we read about kings who would try to seek help from Assyria, right? And that doesn't work. So they're like, okay, we'll try and make deals with Egypt. That doesn't work. We'll try and find make an alliance with Tyre. Well, that doesn't work either. So we've got Tyre, Syria, Assyria, Egypt, all these nations that the northern kingdom is trying to get help from. He's floating around from one to the next at one stage or another, and the whole time never even thinking about going to seek help from God. And God says, do you know what? Ephraim, I'm watching you go from floating backwards and forwards, flitting backwards and forwards from here to there, trying to find answers from here, trying to find strength from there. Do you know, you're like a stupid bird that just can't sit still for 10 minutes. And that's what doves are like if you watch them. I drive down into Frio. One of the roads, it sort of has this big tree and it drops all these like seeds and things on the road. And there's all these narrow roads in Fremantle like that. And often there's just like a flock of birds. I think they're pigeons or doves, but it's quite close to the analogy. And as you drive up, there'll just be the flock of them just sitting on the road there, pecking away right until you drive up, and they seem to just sit there right until the point where you think, I'm going to hit one of these birds, and they just all float away, and then I look in my rear vision mirror, and they're back down again onto these seats, and another car comes, and they're up again into the air. Like, it's just like this over and again, up and down, and it just makes me think of this line from Hosea. They're just like those silly doves. They can't decide what it is that they're really doing, about what to trust, where is a safe place to be, where to sit, where to be still. And God says, you need to move past that. I wonder for you, for myself, and this is our third point of self-examination here that Hosea is getting us to think about, of the struggle that God has with his people. Do you find yourself like that at times? I wonder how does that apply? What do you think? If Ephraim is like a silly dove vacillating from, between where it's going to get its help from, do we do that in our lives? How do we show ourselves sometimes to be like a silly dove? Look, I'm about to say something, Brooke. Yeah, philosophies of the world, absolutely. That's why a lot of different things in the world we can float backwards and forwards on.
I guess there's ideas and perspectives about national at certain times, political ideas, or everybody's on the bandwagon of such and such.
Yeah, I believe in, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, or whoever. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. What about just more like day-to-day kind of stuff? We can put our trust in. What was that? Google. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, probably. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that one, but yeah, that's very true. A lot of misinformation out there. Yeah. But the people watching here on YouTube, that's okay. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Ourselves, for sure. Yep, and trying to, look after things ourselves. I mean, my mind always goes back to someone like Jacob. He's just a classic one of that, trying to solve his own problems for himself. Like money, our job, our career, maybe even like picking up new hobbies to try to fill a void, to just fill up our time rather than potentially seeking God and trying to do something there. It's something else to distract us. Here's the way I see it happen in my own life, and it again comes back to prayer. When things are pretty intense, I find sometimes I have this, burst of prayer. Really, develops and can be quite good for a while. But then when things go starting to get easier, I just find myself going back to doing my own thing. And that's just like Israel. They were trusting in Assyria while they were good. And then when they weren't good, they go to Egypt and they trust in Egypt for a while Egypt had something to offer. So I reckon it does come down to that idea of trusting in ourselves. See, maybe, that's our job. If we're working and our job is good, we kind of put our faith in that while that's going kind of well. Could be that we display and live a life that trusts in anything else other than God. But the question is for each of us to answer personally, does your life reflect someone who really actually trusts in God every day? Like that is rooted and grounded in a trust in God? Or do you look like Ephraim, who whenever trouble came along, they'd just be up and over to Assyria and up and over to Egypt and just unable to sit and be still with God? It's a serious question to be asking ourselves, because that's a struggle that God has with Israel. He's identified that and said, I can't stand this. And it's a struggle that he can have with us as well. How can he work with you and me if we're not praying to him, if we don't acknowledge that he's actually the provider for us and he's looking after everything? But instead, we're seeking help and placing trust and finding solutions from everywhere but God. That's the challenge that Hosea presents to us. And then the fourth one in this chapter is this. In chapter 7, still verse 16, where God calls them a treacherous bow. What do you, does any thoughts from the audience? What does this mean? What do you think this means? A treacherous bow.
Yep.
Yeah, straight in the air and lands on your head or something like that. That's it. Yeah, I think in essence it's a bow that when you need it, it lets you down. Because often it's like if you're being serious with a bow and it's like the critical moment, you're hunting something, whatever the case might be, or defending yourself, and you need it to work for you when you fire off that arrow. And just in that critical moment when you want to fire it off, just when you need it, you pull the arrow, you've got the bow all tightened, and then you let it go, but the bow is bent out of shape. And it just flies off in completely the wrong direction. And God is, again, saying to Ephraim, to Israel here, you know what I really feel about you is that when I need you to be my servant, to be my witness, to be my light to the nations around you, you're like this bow that I can't use because I can't trust what you're going to do. And it relates to all the things we've looked at so far. Being half-baked, having the grey hairs and not noticing, not doing anything about it, being like this silly dove. And it gets to the point where you're like this bow that I'd like to use, but I can't use it anymore. I wish I could. I want to, but I can't. Because you're bent out of shape. You're actually not trustworthy to me anymore. You're not reliable. I can't trust in you. I'm not sure why you're part of this group. I'm not sure why you claim to be a follower of Christ, because there's things that I can't trust in you. I want to trust in you to be an active servant for me, but actually you're not committed. And I think we're seeing the frustration, the difficulty that God has with his people from time to time. I definitely see that in my own life. We have to think on these terms, brothers and sisters. How does God see me and see you? If we're part of our youth group, part of our ecclesia, can he trust me? Can he trust me to be like a reliable bow, is kind of the language he's using here, for his accomplishment and his armies? Can he use me as an instrument, a tool for righteousness? A reliable tool in his hand? Because if I can be, then through God and because of him, he can use me for great things. But sometimes, I know this is true in my own life, I know he sees me as a treacherous bow. And what might that look like in our lives? Maybe the treacherous bow has application in your life, or it's done at times, from time to time. When our influence on other people is actually more for a negative than it is for a good. Have you ever been in that position, maybe? Have you ever been around someone in youth group or the ecclesia when you see that that's actually what that person might be bringing? They're actually bringing something that's actually more negative than good in that group. They're not actually encouraging others. to work with others. They're not encouraging others to be committed to God. They're bringing this kind of, meh, who cares, indifference, encouraging a half-baked discipleship. And that's a treacherous bow to God. Like, he's called us. He wants to use us. But you're not being reliable to do that. So maybe we need to think of the fact that God can and wants to use us as instruments in his hand, as tools in his hand. And he wants to see us as the bow that can fire arrows straight for his purpose. So I think we can summarize the 4 things in chapter 7 like this. God was pointing out a few sort of like hard truths, I suppose, for his people. God was pointing out that they were being half-hearted in their relationship with him. They were being half-baked. And the message is maybe, for us, we need to recommit, potentially, 100% in our discipleship. He was pointing out to them that they were not being reflective in their discipleship with the grey hair example. And what he wants us to do from that example, what he wants us to be as disciples, is self-reflective. To think about how we're going, to check on ourselves, not compared to each other in the ecclesia, but how do we compare to Christ? To his standards, to his love, the way that he dealt with and worked against sin and witnessed for his Father against it. He described the people as being indecisive in their spiritual walk, and he wants us to be decisive, to be courageous, to be decisive and help one another to do that. And he was showing them to be unreliable in their service that he called them to by his grace and mercy. And he wants us to aim, at least, for consistency. That he can use us in a spiritual context amongst his people. So that if there is a brother and sister or sister who is struggling spiritually, that he can use us to help them recover, not to push them away or to drag them down, to not be a useless tool, but to be someone who is there to help others, to help bring about the will of God. So that's our challenge, brothers and sisters. It's the challenge that he gave to Ephraim, to Israel, and it's the challenge that's there for us. And these things have to be practical for us, for each of us to take and to examine, to think about in our own discipleship. So that's some of the difficulty that God has with his people, some of the struggle, the heart wrench he felt when he saw their unfaithfulness is the same heart wrench that he feels when he sees those things in us. And so in our next class, God willing, we'll be looking at another major theme, another major exhortation from the book of Hosea, where the question is asked, who is our king? Who is sovereign and who is ultimately in control in our lives? And seeing how that ties in with one of God's preeminent characteristics, his holiness. But we'll leave it there tonight, and God willing, we'll conclude our series next Wednesday.
Thanks, Vaughn. Some great thoughts there, some really practical lessons, so many good things that we can take with us now, and we can head off into the week and we can put them into practice and learn from those things. Appreciate your thoughts tonight. Just going to have a quick look here, see what we've got for next week. Next week is the 19th of March. Oh, see the schedule, this is what might have been thrown out that you're talking about. Keep an eye out for the announcements and see what you've got coming up next week. And I'm sure you'll look forward to that with eager enthusiasm. All right, we're going to finish our night with our final hymn, which is under hymn number 389, and then prayer and thanks for our supper tonight. Yahweh, our great God, we come to you now, finish our time together. We've had a quiet hour where we can be here together in this place, and we can have some refreshing thoughts run through our minds, and we can think on you, amazing examples you've given us to look to learn from. During the week, there's plenty of things going on around us. There's lots of distractions, there's so much noise. Seems like there's so much negativity around the place, but actually there is more good around than negativity, and we ask that you'd help us to look for this so we can look for you daily in our lives. We can see the things that we need to do to concentrate and focus our thoughts and our minds, that we can bring these thoughts to you every day. We pray to you and acknowledge you, and this is something that we really want to focus on as we leave here now, that we can all take this away, that we can make prayer and action in our lives, that we can do this daily, we can find you, we can look out for those things that you can talk to us with and help guide us. We can look out for others, we can find ways to help them as well. And please help us to give back to you and give back to others in these things. So we head off into our week. We ask that you would watch over us and keep us safe, guide our thoughts and our actions, everything we put our heart and our mind to. Might we do it to the best of our ability, and might we always give you the glory in our lives. Without you, we would have nothing and no hope. So we acknowledge this now and we say our thanks. You've given us some food and drinks to enjoy tonight. We're grateful for this. We never go without. You consistently look down on us and provide for us, and we are really, really thankful for this. So we finish our night now with our prayer to you, and we say our thanks, and we do this in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.